In today's episode, I ask two writers about their experiences in an MFA program. We talk about loneliness, giving and receiving criticism, and some strategies for success. Before we get into today's conversation, I want to take a moment to let you know that this podcast is also available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Music. So feel free to listen on the go or download it for later. Being an artist can be a heck of a ride, but you're not alone. On Journey of the Art, we tell inspiring stories of artists and chat with those who support us on this path. I'm your host, Lola Opatayo, writer, editor, singer, and all-round lover of words. Come with me on the journey. Hi there, and welcome to Journey of the Arts. Today, I have not one, but two guests who are going to tell me about their experiences in an MFA program. Today, we're answering the whats, the whys, and the hows of being in a creative writing MFA program. So I hope you stick around and join the conversation in the comments. Joining me today is Chido Muchemwa. Chido has an MFA in creative writing from the University of Wyoming, and she's a recipient of the Moreland African Writing Scholarship. Her debut short story collection, Who Will Bury You and Other Stories, is out in the US and Canada. And the link to that will be in the description or the show notes. Also joining me is Charlie Muhumuza. Charlie is a current MFA candidate in the creative writing program at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He is a 2024 Oxbelly Fellow and was a finalist for the 2022 Commonwealth Short Story Prize. So welcome, Charlie and Chido.
Thank you, Lola. How are you doing?
I'm good. A little flustered from trying to make sure that everything worked, but I'm good. Welcome. Thank you for joining me.
Happy to be here.
I'm so glad. I'm so excited. Okay, so I appreciate you both really for taking time out of your busy schedules to chat with me today. So let us get into it. People enroll in creative writing programs for a variety of reasons. You know, from wanting to devote time to their craft to wanting to teach writing at an advanced level. And so I'm curious, what did you hope to achieve from getting an MFA? Charlie, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, sure. So I've been writing for a while, maybe seven years into this. Just getting published in various magazines. I've gotten published in almost all major magazines in Africa, journals. So I felt like it was time for me to take a step further. I wanted a place where I can, kind of a place where my writing can be exposed to a wider readership.
Right.
And I thought an MFA in America can help me tap into the American market because I felt like that was the next step for me in my writing career.
Right.
That's mostly what I wanted.
Right. Yeah. What about you, Chido?
Well, the only thing I've ever wanted to be is a writer. So when I got to the end of my undergrad and I needed to figure out what to do next, this was the degree that was available because I knew I wanted to stay in academia. I knew I wanted to be a professor, and creative writing just made sense.
Mm-hmm. That for all valid reasons. But I wanted to ask that because maybe that will inform the rest of the things you're going to tell me today. But thank you so much for sharing that. Would you say that the MFA has had or had any impact on your writing voice? Chido, do you want to start us off on that question?
So to explain first before I go too far, when I applied for the MFA, I was actually a creative nonfiction writer.
Oh.
I was not a fiction writer. I was very much into personal essays. Like my MFA thesis is a memoir about home. But I got to the MFA and I took fiction writing classes, and I was like, I'm lying to myself. I am a fiction writer. So in that way, MFA helped me figure out exactly what my identity was. So it helped me find my voice in that sense. But then for about 2 years after the MFA, I didn't write because I felt like I had to forget a lot of the things that I had been told in the MFA if I was going to get back to my authentic voice.
Why
and
is
by
that?
that, I mean there's like, you're in a workshop and the workshop is full of people who've never read African literature in their life. And
Right.
suddenly they're reading stories over and over again about Zimbabwe. Sometimes they find weaknesses in your story that don't actually exist, but are simply just you writing in a different mode from the stories that they're used to. So I had to
Right.
take a break from writing and just stick to reading and figure out what was actually right about the things they said and what was preference. So
Right.
yeah, helped me find my voice, but I also had to unlearn some things after I walked away.
Right. 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 That is an interesting take. What about you, Charlie?
Well, for me, I came in with a mindset of being stubborn. Honestly, I said I would be stubborn during my time when taking the MFA. And already we've had some workshops, and of course there are things that coming from Africa we don't have to explain to our readers. So the education curriculum, how it works. If I can just give in a small
Of
anecdote.
course.
I workshopped a story recently where it's a coming of age story set in a boarding school, and I used the curriculum, mentioning classes where like O and A level, which is the system that we use nationally, and not as much. We don't use grades like grade 6, grade 7. We use like primary 6 or senior 6, something like that.
Right.
And there was some demands for me to clarify that, and I almost bought into it, but then I realized no. When I'm reading an American story, I don't have to understand what grade 8 is.
Right.
I just take it as a certain level of education. So I think it's important to be stubborn if you have something that you feel like this doesn't need explanation for other people,
Right.
to understand who you're writing for. And for me, I feel like writing is first in service of the self before it gets
Right.
out to the world.
Right.
I have to keep reminding myself that. But otherwise, also, I think it depends so much on the program. I'm in a cohort of 6 fiction writers, and we are all an umbrella term that I was very reluctant to use, but we are all people of color. And so there is that. People read your work carefully because we all have stories that are very different and unique.
Right.
Like every story is set in a different place, and that helps. Whether it's Bangladesh, whether it's Kampala, whether it's Vietnam, all these voices converge. So
Right.
I think the kind of program that it is also influences you.
Right. So, what is I just have a follow-up question based on what you just said about that stubbornness, as you said. What would you say is the thin line between being stubborn, like understanding what exactly you're saying, and not wanting to change something about you that maybe you didn't recognize that you needed to change before? Would you say that there's a thin line between those two things?
Yes, there is a very thin line, and it's easy to cross. But I think it's important to approach any work with humility,
Right.
and anyone's comments with humility,
Right.
so that you don't dismiss them at first instance. Because that's where the line is. Once you dismiss something before investigating it, then you haven't decided. It's just like pure stubbornness. But you take it in with humility and investigate it. Does this work for me? And then be like, no. Not just straight up refusing to listen to your teachers. There is also something whereby people, especially people that I've spoken to that have undertaken MFAs, where they keep their best work, kind of hold it, and not present it for workshop,
Right.
because they don't want it to be destroyed. But I don't agree with that. I think we should trust ourselves more and learn to trust ourselves with what we take from other people in regards to our work.
Right.
Yeah.
But and again, I just have another follow-up question on that, because I can only imagine being in that situation and having to step back with every story to evaluate what is legitimate and I should take that, and what is just people don't understand because they don't have the context. I assume that that's going to be tiring. Is that the case?
I think over time I've spoken to people, even our professors tell us. So the first thing as you get into a story is to know where it's going, what you want out of it, you as a writer. Right. So if someone gives you any piece of advice that doesn't lead you to where you want the story to go, then it may be good advice actually. But then if it's not, if it doesn't serve the story in that it doesn't lead you to the path that you've chosen for the story, then you discard it. And that's why you'll find all these questions that are sometimes unhelpful. They do not lead the story where it wants to go. Someone is just giving you a different avenue to take within your own story. Yeah.
Right.
I think that's where the question is for me.
Right. Chido, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, I actually did. Another thing that happens in workshops, one of the benefits of having a small cohort is you have the same people reading your stuff over and over again. And after one or two times of being in workshop, you realize that there are two or three people who are just better readers of your work than other people.
Right.
So you learn to identify the people who are actually going to move you forward and the people who like, yeah, you still read what they're saying, but you also know that they're more likely to be a little off on their understanding of your work.
Right.
So once you know those people, it becomes a lot easier to figure out which feedback to sit with longer and which feedback to be like, okay, this isn't relevant to the story.
Right. So let's flip it now. We've talked about you receiving criticism. How have you given criticism in an MFA program? How did you handle giving criticism? Are there stories that you read and felt like, I'm not entirely sure what's going on here? And how did you just manage? Because I know us Africans, we have a direct way of speaking that isn't, totally appreciated in this part of the world. So how did you handle that part of things? Let me see. Who's gonna?
Okay, I give what I've been doing.
Okay.
I'll say, so this is a problem that has been encountered before. So there is sort of a set of rules to follow when giving feedback. You summarize the story for how you understood it to be, because sometimes some people get really off, and then you give a couple of things that you loved about it that were working, and then you get into the critique of it, of what didn't work. I think the biggest problem for me has been sometimes I don't want to be mean, or thinking maybe my advice won't be taken, or I can leave that for something else, because you don't want to sound too. You don't be this surgeon that is just like cutting someone's work all through. Yeah.
Right.
So I'll try to be honest and try to pick the most important things, but I still have doubts whether that's good for my. Oh God, if they don't see this and think that I'm holding back on my.
Oh, they sure will.
Yeah, but I try to lead with kindness in that regard. Yes, and if something is so minor, I just. Or I ask a leading question, something that can help them think about it without it being a suggestion as such.
Yeah.
That's how I'm going about it. But I believe Chido has a better method.
I wouldn't say it's a better method. It's just that one of the things I had a workshop early on where the professor said people's instincts about your story, about what's not working, are almost always right. Their solutions about how to fix the problem are almost always wrong. So I always come into a critique with that kind of humility of, I can help you identify what's not working, but I'm not going to give you prescriptions of how to fix it. Because I have a background as a tutor and as teaching, I know how students can be set back by getting like just raw feedback that just says this isn't working. So I always think of the purpose of a critique is to help the writer write the next draft.
Right.
Like, how do I help them keep putting words on the page? So instead of saying this wasn't working for me, I frame it as a question to be, what exactly were you attempting to do here? Because this is how it came across to me. How do you think you can fix it to get towards the thing that you're trying to get? And I think when it becomes questions, it starts to feel more like a conversation and not just because like Charlie said, some people don't want to bring their work to workshop because they don't want it to be shredded. I don't want anyone to ever be like, oh, I don't want to read Chido's critiques because she's just going to pull it apart. I want it to be like, oh, she's going to give me some thoughts and ideas and questions to figure out how to write the next draft.
Right. And so, Chido, you finished your MFA how many years ago?
8 years.
8 years ago. Would you say that that's something that you stumbled on at the start? Like your program was a 2-year program. So is that something that you would say that you had to learn when you started the program?
It definitely was something I had to learn, and I also needed to be gain a little more confidence in my own ability to read. Because
Right.
definitely the first year where I was a nonfiction writer in fiction classes, I felt like I didn't have the authority to like
Right.
tell people what wasn't working in
Right.
their work. But I'm a reader. Like I don't need to be a writer to be able to critique work.
Right.
Being a reader, reminding myself that I'm a reader and I know what works on the page was a one of the ways I got that confidence. And the thing about workshop is it's every week. It's every
Mm,
week, right? And just that practice of having to do it, you eventually figure out a system and you figure out what's not working for you when people critique your work and be like, okay, I don't want people to feel this way. I'm gonna
right.
do things differently.
Right. So I have another follow-up question to this idea of giving feedback. Would you say that it put any pressure on you to deliver on your own work? So if you have, I don't know how many exercises, reading exercises or writing exercises, and then you do have to give feedback, how would you say that that impacted on your ability to do your own work? First of all, even thinking, okay, I'm an African, how do I distill this in a neutral, nice way so people don't think I'm, trying to chop up their work? And how do I deliver the best or prefer the what I consider to be the best solutions? So do you think that that impacted your ability to do your work as a writer?
Could I ask a clarifying question?
Of
You're
course.
asking about the amount of time it takes to do critiques, right? Whether that
Precisely.
impacts the amount of time
Precisely.
as a
Yes.
writer. Well, personally, no. One of the things that was very great about our MFA program is it was a very light load in terms of classes. We had a lot of free time to concentrate on our writing. I would dedicate maybe one afternoon of the week to doing critiques.
Right.
Also, it depends on how many workshops you're in that semester. If you're in 2 or 3 workshops, yeah, that's gonna be intense. But for most of the time, you're only in 1 or 2, and you just learn to like move things around
Right.
and just create those pockets of time for the critiques. Last thing I'll say, and then I'll keep quiet. Um, Critiques are learning in their own way. Like sometimes being able to read someone else's story and be like, okay, this isn't working. It's like a light bulb moment for like, oh, that's why that isn't happening in my story.
Yes.
So it is an education in its own time. So it doesn't take away from the writing. It's just another way to
Right.
think about the writing.
Right. Right. Charlie, do you have
Um,
anything to add?
yeah, just hopping off what Chido has said last. I find writing critiques very helpful in learning about my own work and my own process, because you're trying to read the intention of the writer.
Right.
What did they intend to write, and how's that coming across? And I can really feel or myself trying to pay closer attention to my work. Trying to close the gap between my intention and what appears on the page.
Right.
So that's a skill that I'm picking up from that. But in terms of time management, it's always a challenge. Uh, I have a workshop for about 3 hours every week, and then I teach a class for about 2 hours, and then I have a class on teaching, pedagogy, where I have to learn how to teach. Yeah, something like that. Uh, so between the readings for all those classes, crafting my syllabus, marking my students' work, uh, the readings for the workshop stories, because we also have to read like a book at least every 2 weeks. I have to create time for myself to write, actually,
Right.
not just read, because you also want to read beyond what has been prescribed for you.
Right.
So, yeah, it has been a bit of a challenge, and I'm just trying to fix, if I'm being honest with you, I'm trying to fix a writing routine,
Yeah.
but it's not so easy, because writing can be the hardest of all those things. Writing something that you're satisfied with, not just putting words on a page, but something
Yeah.
you're satisfied with. So, but I try to at least write a certain number of words a week. That's my goal for now. Yes.
Yeah, that's the your responses are pretty similar to what I thought it would be. And I'm wondering if your experience, Charlie, is different because maybe things have changed. I don't know. And because it's been 8 years since you did yours, Chido. And maybe there's more demand on
I
the
actually have a
writers.
theory. I actually have
Okay,
a theory.
let's hear
I
this
think
theory.
Charlie lives in a place
Let's hear
that's
it.
more interesting than Wyoming. Like, I didn't have a social life in Wyoming, right? Like, I wasn't hanging out with people. There was
Yeah.
nothing to do in that little town. So it gave me lots of free pockets of time because that was how I entertained myself by doing my writing.
Wow. Okay, so let's talk about the community, right? Because you just talked about hanging out. And I'm curious about what community looked like or looks like for you, Charlie, in your writing program. What are some relationships that you're grateful for? And what are some relationships that soured as a result of your MFA?
To clarify, are you talking about the community here, or because the last bit of that question seems to
Yes,
take
so
away from?
yes, the community in your MFA program. Yes.
Yeah, it's a very close, tight knit program. We are 6 students in my fiction cohort, and then Madison has this rotating kind of system. So they admit fiction and poetry in alternating years. So even years they bring in the fiction cohort, and then odd years it's for poetry. But then because it's such a small program, that makes us about 12 MFA students in total, plus 5 post MFA fellows that apply each year. You try to get to know these people. So you try to hang out after class and all this, but then you'll gravitate towards some people. Yeah, but we are getting to know each other, and so it's an interesting stage. Yeah, but in terms of community, I can't say I feel grounded yet,
Right.
because on top of like coming here for an MFA, being in a new university, I'm also coming to a very different culture
Right.
that I grew up in. Very different culture,
Right.
very different ways of making friends, very different ways of socializing. Food, almost everything is very different. So I'm trying to learn two things at the same time: the culture as well as the work that I'm supposed to do. And it has been sort of a challenge,
Yeah.
but not one that's not manageable. I want to believe it's manageable.
Yeah. What about you, Chido?
It's a funny question for me to answer because I am very much a loner. So, like, I mostly do things by myself. But I will say, our cohort, University of Wyoming, takes in 9 students every year, so 3 for each genre. And when you go to like the fiction workshops, they would all seem like this big group and like they all know each other, like they're going drinking together and things like that. And because everyone takes fiction classes, because everyone knows that's where the money is, then you go to like your nonfiction classes, and it's just the 3 of you in your cohort who are in the
Yeah.
classes. So you would get a chance to like have big interactions, but you'd also get that chance to have like one-on-ones with people because you're in a smaller genre that's less popular. So I appreciated the closeness that I had with my nonfiction cohort because I felt like we knew each other a lot better. And I mean that as writers, we knew each other exactly what a person was trying to do, how they were trying to do it. So sometimes I'd be out and about in the world and I'd find something and be like, oh, this person in my cohort, this would be very useful to them. So we were able to better help each other because it was such a small cohort.
Right. And did critiquing each other's work affect the relationship or no?
So creative nonfiction. Was actually a lot less troublesome than fiction. There's a thing that happens in fiction workshops where people will write thinly veiled personal stories as a short story, and then you critique the story to be like, oh, this thing doesn't feel real. And they're like, but it really happened. And I'm like, that's actually irrelevant to what we're doing here because it's a story. We need to
Yeah.
make it work as a story, not as the thing that happened in your life. So I will say fiction workshops, there were some people where there was tension afterwards, but it didn't last long. It was
Right.
just, sometimes you'd be a little because they would take things personally. Because that's the thing about critique. Sometimes, even if you have an elaborate armor, sometimes things are going to get in under your armor. And if you let it linger or you let it fester, you could end up not talking to people or start resenting them simply
Yeah.
because you didn't like how they said what they said.
Yeah.
Yeah. On that as well, I can say supporting people that read your work very carefully can help build friendships because they show some interest. One thing I've discovered here is that people don't tend to show interest in you or your work because you're from a very different background or they don't know much about it. So when you see someone that reads your work closely, it's easy to talk to them, you know. So I think that helps in the way they read your work and receive it. It can help build a sort of community. And also, we come from a very different storytelling traditions. So you find that people from the non-Western world have a more narrative style of writing, you know. The storytelling is actually a story. It's not a scene by scene telling or something. And you end up having that kind of connection with them, maybe. Yeah. So I think there is usually a connection between people from the other parts of the world. Yeah, but I don't think it's in bad faith or kind of clicking. It's just more that there is a way people understand each other and their work and their traditions that are closer linked than they are to those of America.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a very smart thing that you said right now about connecting with those who connect with your stories. And I hadn't thought about the possibility that people may not want to read your work because they are far removed from the reality from which you've written that story. So, and I saw you nodding vigorously, Chido, like, yes, that is correct. That did happen. So thank you so much for sharing that. So this next question is related. It's closely related. And it's a question about if you felt homesick. So I know, Chido, you immigrated from Zimbabwe, correct? No? That is correct. That is not the truth. Where from?
I moved to America when I was 19 to college. So I had like 5 years in America at undergrad before I started the MFA.
Right. Okay. So then you did have some knowledge of the culture. It wasn't so alien to you.
Wyoming was nothing like anything I had ever expected. Let me tell you about homesickness as a person who lived in many different places. Wyoming, you know, when we're talking about giving people advice about the MFA, it is important to think about how you will fare in the environment that you're going in. Sometimes you might pick a strategy like I did, where I just applied to fully funded MFAs. That was the only criteria I had. But when you start to see snow at the end of September, you start to think, you know, maybe I should have thought about this a little harder.
You're scaring Charlie right
Wyoming
now.
was, look, whatever you're expecting in Madison, just know that Mother's Day snow is a thing in Wyoming. Like that's the end of the snow season. So from September to May, it could snow at any point. I remember the first day I walked out and the temperature was minus 40 degrees. And I know what you're thinking. Was that minus 40 Fahrenheit or Celsius? It actually doesn't matter because when the temperature gets that low, they start to merge. So it's minus 40 either way. And yeah, I was homesick. But that wasn't even the worst of the homesickness. Wyoming is a very small population and it's very isolated. Sometimes when it snows, the highways are closed for days, so there's no like way to get out of your little town. It was hard to be in such a cold place, a snowy place, and I have to be honest, there was a lot of racism in that place because Wyoming is like 98% white. I would have people yell out slurs at me while I was walking in the Walmart parking lot. That made it extremely hard to be in that place. So, homesickness is a thing, but you find ways to alleviate the homesickness. For me, it was important to join the African Students Association. That's always a good place to start. I took a class with a Black professor solely for the purpose of taking a class with a Black professor, and she turned out to be my champion pretty much. Like, in so many ways, she's helped me since then because as a Black woman, she knows what it's like being in academia and she's helped me out. So, do not let the homesickness fester. There are ways to like find ways to like make yourself feel better. And it's not always as extreme as Wyoming. Like even as Charlie was talking about the food, you're not the first person to be in that place and be worried about food. Someone has a connection somewhere. You just have to find the person who has the
Yeah, find the African stores, the ones that operate from the house. That was a side comment, but yeah, find the African stores. What about you, Charlie?
I really need to do that. For me, homesickness has honestly come in the form of food because it's a very diverse place. So there is a lot of Korean food and Chinese food, food from all over the world. But then, like, I miss Ugandan food. I need it, And sometimes I can't. I skip meals because there's nothing on the menu that I can
Oh
have.
wow.
And then I'm sick of rice. Like I've had rice almost every day, which is sort of a Ugandan food, but then you get tired of it. And I can't seem to find matoke anywhere, which I didn't know that I loved while I was back home. But because it had to be on the menu at least 3 times a week, I now miss it so much. But on the weather, it's so funny. The first thing people told me when I came here, very gleefully, was how terrible the snow is. The winter is. Like, they were so excited to tell me how bad it is.
Yeah.
Like, oh, you just be here. Wait for the winter. Wait for the winter. And I was so excited about it. And they made me buy winter jackets at the start of fall.
Yeah.
So I'm worried about it. It's going to be my first snow ever because I just came in August.
Yeah.
Straight up from Uganda. I finished my bachelor's. I worked as a lawyer for about 6 years, but I felt like I needed more to go into this line of work. And so I applied for an MFA and I got it.
Yeah.
But then I had mentally prepared for the homesickness. We had this in a side chat before, but I knew that I would miss home. Yeah, and sort of mentally guided myself against it because it can be, as Chido said, it's like a festering wound. You don't want to keep feeding it. You have to find ways to alleviate it. I've tried making friends with people. I wouldn't say I'm a very, let me say, social person, but I do need friends because, as I said, it's a very different system of friendship from where I come from to what is here. Friendship where I come from in Uganda is not sought out as much. It just is. It exists.
Yeah.
You know people and they're your friends. You've known them for a while.
Yeah.
Here, friendship is very intentional. You have to do activities together. You have to, talk about things. You have to. I wouldn't say transactional, but it's a very intentional thing you have to do, and it saves you in a way from the loneliness because it can be a very lonely place. And you don't want to live online because you're trying to connect with people back home, which is a problem I encountered in my first few weeks. I realized I was living half the day online, which is a slippery slope, terrible thing.
Yeah.
And I ended up deleting actually Instagram and Twitter because I was just, DMs, talking to my friends, making jokes, but I wasn't living in the experience that I'm supposed to be. So I had to delete them and face the world in front of me as it is.
Yeah, for sure.
I feel like I meandered way too much, but
yeah, that's okay. That's okay. I mean, I can relate to some of the things. Chido, you go for it.
I just thought of something as Charlie was talking about. One of the things that I used to deal with homesickness is I always knew when next I was going home.
Right.
And I know what you're thinking. How can you afford to go home? This was a strategy I went into the MFA program with. You come up with research projects that require you to go home, and then you apply for research funding. I went
That is a
home
good
3
tip.
times during my MFA. One time was for 3 months, the other time was for 4 months. And all of those trips were funded by the University of Wyoming because they were research projects. So you can go home. You just have to figure out how you're going to get somebody else to pay for it. So that was one of the most important skills that I learned in the MFA was how do you come up with projects that someone else will pay for you to go to other places.
Charlie is literally taking notes right now.
I'm taking notes, honestly, because I need this.
Oh, I have so many thoughts. You should email me because the other thing I did is I didn't want to be in Laramie, which is where University of Wyoming is. So I used to go to conferences all the time. And all of these conferences have diversity scholarships. So I was having people pay for me to like go to all these cities across America that I'd always gone to. Like I ended up in Arkansas of all places
Wow.
because I just wanted to get out of Wyoming. It's very possible to see America on someone else's dime if you're
Mm,
very targeted with how you're framing your research and explaining the importance of you visiting specific places to
yeah.
do that work.
Yeah. It's amazing that you just talked about funding because that was going to be my next question. So people usually, and I say people, this is an assumption, so feel free to correct me, but I know as an African that one of the things that I was looking out for when I started applying to MFAs. By the way, I don't even know if I shared this that I do not have an MFA, so disclaimer for anyone who's listening. But while I was applying, I was only applying to fully funded schools because it was just too expensive for me to pay out of pocket from Nigeria. So I know that a lot of people like me did do that, look for schools that were fully funded. But I also know that even though these schools are fully funded and they give you some sort of stipend, it's still a struggle to sustain yourself. So I wanted to ask a question about that. So with that, with limited working hours and your tons of writing and reading to do, what are some ways that writers can sustain themselves, or at least manage that season of limited funding? And I'll look to you, Chido, for an answer.
I didn't actually know all these things when I was still a student, an MFA student. When I moved to Austin, which had a high cost of living, that was when I had to learn to hustle because I was always chasing rent, always behind on rent. Um, I think the first thing is, however dire your financial situation is, do not work more than is legally allowed. Because if you get in trouble with immigration, there is no one who can save you. That's you and immigration. You're going to have to work it out. So, whatever it is that's going on, try your best to avoid getting in the crosshairs of immigration.
Yeah.
That's the first place to start. But I used to get extra income in many different ways. So, all of these psychology departments, especially if you're at a big university, they have medical trials and like all sorts of trials that they're doing. And you'll get like $20 or you'll get $40. I did one for a week where I actually got $200. So, that was one of the ways that I earned extra income. Tutoring is also an easy one, especially if you are. So, because I've already told you that you're going to learn how to be excellent at applying for things, once you've figured out how to be excellent at applying for things, if you can get hired to tutor people for applications, you always get paid a higher rate than if you're just tutoring a regular subject. So, I used to tutor people who were applying for GRE, and I was paid like $80 an hour.
Wow.
Don't tell the tax man. So tutoring was one of the ways I did it. And then it's important to find people in your community who are like from a similar background from you, because if you're like old Africans who are in the neighborhood will be
Mm,
like, "Oh, can you help me move this in my house? Oh, can you pick up my groceries for me?" You're never gonna find big pockets of money in terms of
right.
side hustles. You're never gonna find big pockets of money. You're always going to be like little bits until they add up to something, unless
Right.
you're doing something like a Uber Eats or that kind of thing. But if you just got off the plane, you probably don't own a car because owning a car in America is extremely expensive. So those were the things that I did to earn money. But also, those are the guaranteed income. But you also want to apply to writing contests. I apply indiscriminately to writing contests. I look like I have a high success rate, but I actually probably only win like one in every 30 or 40 applications. Because if I qualify and the application fee is like less than $5, I'm going to send my story out. So
Wow.
once you have started writing and you got a sizable chunk of stories, just send them out. Because I always tell myself it's not my job to count myself out. Let the
Mm,
judging committee do their job. Don't be telling them your story isn't good enough. Just send the story out. Because I've had stories that won $50. I've had stories that won $7,500. Like you don't know.
wow.
Just send the story out.
That is fantastic. Charlie, do you
seven
have anything
thousand
to add?
five hundred dollars. That's
Those are
crazy.
Canadian dollars. I would like to make
Oh,
sure you
true.
understand they were Canadian. It's more like 6,000 American. Like They were Canadian dollars.
Yeah, but in the way of extra income, I've seen we have a system where you can lead workshops outside the university, say in prisons, sort of things, and children maybe. So we have the department send us emails that have all these details, and you could apply for them. But I think it's very, if you are applying for an MFA, I think try to look at how much money people are given and the cost of living around the area, because those are the most important things.
Right.
Otherwise, you get super stressed. I think application is where it is. I don't think an MFA is worth it to pay out of pocket for. Like, it's really not. It's really not. It's sort of like a fellowship of 2 years, maybe. So you're just getting out of the world, but it's a very limited time and temporary situation for you to pay tens of thousands of dollars for. So I wouldn't tell anyone to ever apply for an MFA that's not funded, unless you have the super extra money,
Right.
Unless you're like a millionaire or something, then you could, because it doesn't hurt. But for anyone looking at finances as a question, make sure it's a fully funded program. Apply according to how much money is given. If it's John Hopkins at the top with 35,000, send them and apply to them. Send to places where the money is high, and then the cost of living is low. That's what I try to follow. I actually applied to very few places, but I knew it would be places that could somewhat sustain me, and I'm not having a challenge as such, honestly. I've seen people say the money is not enough, but if you're living a very normal lifestyle that's not super extravagant, you can afford to pay your rent and like eat out a few times a week, and it will be enough. So it's all about the funding, honestly.
Right.
That you should look at.
Right. So, Chido, it's been 8 years since your MFA. You're now currently doing your PhD, I believe.
I'm done with the PhD.
You're done with the PhD. See, you're a rock star. And you have a new book out, Who Will Bury You and Other Stories. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Who Will Bury You and
There
Other
she
Stories,
is.
which has like the most delightful cover ever. Funny story about this cover. This was my number 3 pick. Can you believe how bad my judgment was? That I was like, no, this is number 3. And my editor ignored me because clearly she knew better than I did. But Who Will Bury You and Other Stories is 12 stories, people in Zimbabwe, people in Canada, and they're all just navigating loss and shifting identities and just like what it means to leave home and what it means to come back. 3 of the stories in the collection were at the very least started in my MFA. 2 of them were actually published while I was in the MFA. Special shout out to Chasing Mermaids, which was shortlisted for the Short Story Day Africa Prize. And that one was right in the middle of the MFA. It was probably the first story I finished and sent out while I was doing the program. So MFA definitely set me on my way. But yeah, collection is out in Canada and the US right now. Charlie already has his copy.
He already has his.
Get your own copy too. It's a delightful little collection, if I do say so myself. And what I appreciate about the collection is it documents my development as a writer over the decade. Because when I look at the stories that I was writing in the MFA and like the latest stories that I write in that collection, it's like, okay, I've developed so much and I've come so far, and it's being able to see the steps that I took to continue learning even after the MFA and kind of the products makes it very rewarding and like enriching to like be able to hand this book to people and be like, this is the last decade of my life.
Right. That's amazing. I will leave the link to your book in the description or the show notes for anyone who wants to get it. Charlie, do you have anything you want to highlight?
Allow me to start with this beautiful, beautiful book. The stories in here, Kariba Heights, they're just stories you'll fall in love with. Chido, you did a really good thing with these. Like, I read a few, like 3 so far, and yeah, it has fallen in my heart. Like, it's just as beautiful as the cover. Um, Currently, I'm working on my own collection of stories. Uh, yeah, but I'm just putting them through workshop. And one thing that we haven't spoken about that I think is important is if you're applying for an MFA, please come with work ready if you can afford to. Because we talked about time for writing, but
Yeah.
the stories that I've submitted so far are stories that I worked on before. And when you're given feedback, there is always space for improvement. But if they are improving upon a first draft, it's harder than if they're improving upon a third draft, which needs less work and you'll be less stressed. So
Yeah.
if you could come with a novel or a short story collection or at least a sizable amount of stories, please do. And then an MFA shouldn't be a place to tick off your list as an emerging writer. I think you need to be ready for it. Like, this is the right time for it. Otherwise, it will make you hate writing. People take off writing after MFAs. It's very common. So you should be ready with your work if possible, so that this is the time of editing and meeting people and sending work out to these journals, and you have an address. Because so many of them favor people that are stationed on this continent, at least on the Western world. Yeah. So come ready with your stories. Yeah.
Yeah, that is a wonderful way to end what you were just saying, because I was going to ask a question and I highlighted it. I was like, well, it depends on how the conversation goes, but I'll just ask it anyway. So been a long argument about the benefits of getting an MFA. Some say you need it, some say you don't. And Charlie, I hear you saying like you need to know what time you are, as what season you are as a writer, and determine if this is the right season to do an MFA. Chido, what are your thoughts on that? Do you think that an MFA, this is a very dicey topic. What do you think? Do you think an MFA is needed?
First off, I don't think MFAs are necessary. I think we all, if we want to be a writer, we all have to learn the skills somewhere, and the MFA is just one place where you can learn the skills. The most important thing, I think, in your development as a writer is just to read. MFA, in a lot of ways, just concentrates your learning. You get to do it quickly and you get feedback immediately. It just makes your development move, just almost like pressing fast forward on your development. But as someone who spent 2 years not writing after the MFA, when I started the PhD and I said to myself, no, I need to recommit to my writing and not let the PhD take over. That was when I really actually started to think about, well, what do I mean when I say I need to learn with the writing? And one of the things I knew is I needed feedback. You don't need professors to have feedback. You don't need to have a MFA cohort to have feedback. I was I was sending my stories out to journals that I knew give emerging writers feedback. So that was a wonderful way of getting feedback. I would sign up for like 1 day workshops. There are a lot of organizations wherever you live who provide like 1 day workshops for writers, and you find one on world building and you go and you probably share a little bit of your writing, you get feedback. But most importantly for me is I found a group of African writers in Toronto. They called themselves the East African Writers Group, and they let me join, even though I'm from Southern Africa. But um, in that group, I just had people who were coming from a similar background from me. I didn't have to explain that many things to them. And even though we were all at like different stages in our development as a writer, we were able to recreate the same learning atmosphere of the MFA. And we were doing it for free. And fortunately, because we were in Toronto, a lot of the resources we needed, we could just get them for free at the Toronto Public Library. There are so many places where you can get the information you need. If you are talking to other writers, you will figure out where you can learn the things you want to learn. MFA is just one pathway. You're taking a serious time out of your life, right? Like for 2 years, I was stuck in Wyoming. I wasn't making any real connections out there because, place was full of racists. Um, I wasn't moving forward in any other career except the writing career. I was isolated from my family. It's like you've taken 2 years out And you have to be able to justify taking those 2 years out. And if you're not able to justify those 2 years out, there are other options. Plenty of fabulous writers who sell millions of books who have never seen the inside of a workshop. It's just one way.
Yeah. So I remembered something that you said earlier on. You were talking about how you took some time off from your MFA and you took 2 years off. How much unlearning did you, in terms of a percentage, how much would you say you had to unlearn from the things you learned in your MFA? Could that be like 30% or 40% or 20?
I don't think I can put a percentage. It was more that I had to figure out how to stop people in the workshop being the voice in my head and get back to
Right.
me being the voice in my head.
Right.
Because there'll be time where I'd be. The thing about workshop is if you're in workshop long enough, you know the things that set people off. So when you write a story, you're like, oh, I'm going to take this out because I know people are going to spend the whole day harping on about it.
Right.
And taking those instincts, unlearning those instincts was what I had to get rid of. Just
Right.
getting back to where my voice is the one that's in my head.
Right. Right. That is wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. Charlie, do you have anything to add?
I'm just getting into it, so so I don't think I have anything that's different from what Chido has to say about this particular thing. I think it goes back to what your intention is with the story and
Yeah.
what you discussed.
Yeah. Well, anyway, thank you so much to the both of you for joining me today. I've learned a lot from you, and I really appreciate you sharing your insights today. Thank you for joining me. Chido, all the best with your work. I hope to be able to get my hands on a copy soon. I have put out an order for it. So thank you once again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lola.
You're welcome.
It was nice seeing you, Chido.
Great to see you, Charlie.
On the next episode, I'll be chatting with another inspiring artist. But before then, I'd love to hear from you. Tell me what you think about this show and this episode. Feel free to drop me a note here or send me a DM on Instagram at Journey of the Art Pod. Finally, please subscribe if you're watching this on YouTube, or follow and rate the show if you're listening elsewhere. Help me connect with other artists who need a dose of inspiration today. Until next time, stay on the journey of your art.